Good for you.
At least we don't have snow.
Right.
We only have smoke at certain times.
All right. Yeah.
Dear colleagues and friends, this is the last flash mob of 2020, and we have decided to offer you a discussion on a more general topic. Tonight's flash mob is entitled Nature and Nurture, and we have invited two very prominent linguists in the field, namely Charles Young from the University of Pennsylvania and Ken Wexler from MIT, to share their views to open up the debate. As usual, the two opponents will exchange ideas and give us their view by answering 3 questions offered by the moderator, and we'll have 5 minutes each to give us the answers. At the end, the moderator will summarize and comment the results, and we open the discussion, which will include questions from Zoom and YouTube as well. For security reasons, the chat, microphone, and screen sharing functions have been disabled during the debate, but the chat will be active at the end for you to write if you intend to ask a question, and we will enable your microphone. Those of you who won't be able to ask their questions can send them to me via email to the following address, ceciliapoletto@gmail.com, and I will collect the questions and send them to the speakers for a later reply. The event is being streamed on YouTube, so if you ask a question, you're giving implicitly your consent to be streamed and recorded. Please feel free to distribute the link of our YouTube registration with the flyer to students and colleagues and post it on your social media. And now I leave the floor to Maria Teresa Guasti, who will moderate tonight's epic battle in linguistic history.
Thank you, and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone, depending on the place where you are. So tonight we are featuring Ken Wexler and Charles Young. Ken Wexler is Emeritus Professor at MIT and has contributed to the field of language acquisition through different lines of research. More recently, his focus is on language acquisition in different pathological conditions, going from autism, specific or primary language impairment, Down syndrome, and Williams syndrome, with the goal of understanding how the computational system of human language works. Going back in time, he has contributed to the field with several research on passive, raising, clitics, with a strong theoretical orientation, whereby I mean that language acquisition data can be used to shape theory of language. Charles Young is professor at the University of Pennsylvania and combine research in language acquisition, computer science, and cognitive science. He is well known for his work on the variational learning model, where parameters and probabilities are associated. Moreover, he has worked on the acquisition of linguistic rules and proposed the tolerance principle to account for how to deal with irregularities while acquiring a language or in the process of language change, another dimension highly connected to language acquisition. So, and now we start with our first question, which will be taken by Charles Young. And the first question is: imperfect input, perfect acquisition, which is the best language acquisition models? Please, Charles, you have 5 minutes, and I have my timeline. Okay, please.
Great. Well, thanks for putting this together. Happy holidays, everybody. It's good to see so many people I've missed during all these months. And also, I want to start by thanking Ken. I mean, as many of you know, I didn't plan to do language acquisition. I took a class with Ken. I started doing language acquisition. So it's good to have this conversation after, say, 22 years. On my view, we can't quite talk about language acquisition model without talking about a combination of two components. One is the theory of linguistic structure, and that has to be coupled with theory of learning. So I want to come back to the phrasing of the question, namely imperfect input and perfect language acquisition. I think those two statements have to be qualified, and we can qualify them by quantifying them, namely by doing some counting, by looking at some data. So I want to bring out, I think, 5 observations that may be familiar to some segment of the population, but they need to be known together. Some of them fairly well known, some are not. Okay, so the first part is really the sparsity of linguistic data. This follows Zipf's law, so namely lots of things that are possible won't be attested, so children must generalize. And that's one of the design constraints on language acquisition. The second one is what Bill LeBeau refers to as the uniformity, or what he calls the enigma of uniformity of language learning. That is that despite all the individual differences in their local circumstances, everybody in the speech community acquire more or less the same grammar. This is especially striking if you look at children's vocabulary composition are vastly different from one to the other. And the third component, I would really is more empirical about language acquisition. That is that we know children know a lot, but they don't know everything. And some kids learn English, some kids learn French, some kids learn Chinese. For many aspects of child language, they learn the language of particular properties very early. I'll refer you to some of the work that Virginia Valiant and I individually, but also collectively have done on this acquisition of determiners. But some other aspects are actually quite late. So what I have in mind would be cases like the well-known case of English past tense, as well as many cases that say goes back to Carol Chomsky's work, documenting some fairly late phenomena of language acquisition. And the fourth component, I think, is also going to be important for the theory of acquisition would be there's some very fine-grained individual and dialect level differences. And they persist into adulthood. These are not random variations, but they're governed by general principles as well as, again, their local experience. And sometimes there are genuine individual differences. As a recent example, I was discussing the so-called dative verbs with a bunch of friends. It turns out that Beth Levine conceived donate as a part of a class called future giving, where Norbert Holstein didn't. Okay, so maybe one became a linguist, the other became a philosopher. And finally, and this is quite important, and this is, I think, I believe relatively new, that is that there's actually a striking degree of systematicity and regularity in a very small subset of data, namely the words that occur with extremely high frequency, words that children likely learn very early. This is something I don't think is widely known to everybody. This really came out during my investigation of using the tolerance principle for language acquisition. So putting this together, these are, I think, are the boundary conditions on what a possible and impossible theory of language acquisition would be. It has to be the combination of the linguistic structure as well as the theory of learning, which must allow this stability across individuals, but as well as the plasticity to account for individual differences. And this again invites a look at the division of labor between theory of language, linguistic structures, and theory of learning, and how they can together combine to contribute to the goal of explanatory adequacy. So I guess that's my take on the question of what's the best model for language acquisition. We can never speculate about the best, but I think these are the constraints on what a possible model must be. Turn the table to.
Okay, thank you. And I give the floor to Ken. Ken?
Yes,
Yes.
thanks. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me and for inviting Charles. And I should say back to Charles that his attempts to connect the model of language learning with real language acquisition is a breath of fresh air, and has, I think, interested quite a few people. And I guess the questions we're discussing is what is the best way to do this? Because the truth is that we really haven't had a model of learning, the learning part of the model that's interacted well with actually real language acquisition. There's lots of remarkable work on real language acquisition, but the learning model that goes with it has been rather sketchy and not worked out. In fact, I would say that if you take the basic structure of the theory, still accepting the principles and parameter theory, which was a major advance, that in fact, we still do not have any kind of an acceptably decent theory of parameter setting. Okay. And I know that's hard to fathom after all these years. Okay. So if you look back at what happened before parameter setting, there was a time when learning models were really important for the field. I don't think they are right now, but they were at an earlier time. So if you look back, well, let me share the screen on this one. All right. Let me make it a slideshow. Hold it.
Ça ne marche pas. Ça n'y arrive pas.
Oh, down here. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. So earlier theories, there are actually formal theories which actually excited the field a great deal. I don't think they have right now, and that's what I'm worried about. And that includes my own work now, by the way. That one of the important results of the earliest work on language grammar in an older linguistic framework was to work on feasibility. And the proof that transformational grammars, these complex beasts, were actually learnable from the simplest data, degree 2 data, excited the field no end. But the reasons it did that, I think, was not only the result, which was a result of extensive mathematical research, but also the fact that the results demanded a great constraining of the theory of grammar, and those constraints could then be empirically tested. Some of the constraints were in fact rather novel, and in fact have proved lasting since. For example, the freezing principle, which was assumed strictly for learnability reasons, then you could actually prove played a real role in grammar to this day in the work of many people, but Chris Collins and others, and on language acquisition models like Himes and Snyder's model concerning certain structures, okay? And they all, but the degree 2 idea was that you didn't need extensive data, that very great processing of data, depth of embedding of 4 or 5, anything like that, in order to get these unlimited capacity for grammar. So this is the imperfect input in the sense that it's a greatly restrained input. The primary linguistic data is obviously greatly constrained. It turns out, by the way, we know from the work of Leiter Gleitman and this Newport and Henry Gleitman, we know that the input to the kid is not very ungrammatical, unlike some earlier thoughts on it. It's mostly grammatical. Of course, there's some starts and stops, but kids presumably has pragmatic abilities to figure that out. But it's greatly understated. I mean, it's small compared to the capacity the kid gets. I think that's the biggest aspect, most significant aspect of the imperfect input. Okay, so that really greatly excited the field. And since then, and in fact, I say in later slides, but I obviously won't have time to go through them. Those constraints, including the binary principle, which turned out to be equivalent to subjacency, and many other constraints that whose name everybody forgets, including me, no bottom context, and so on. What they had the function of reducing the complexity of transformations that had to be analyzed and the way that you could expand the types of structures that fit transformations as you went up a tree. Okay. Now, what happened soon after that was the field found a way of stating transformations in an extremely simpler way. Move NP was the only transformation that existed, if those of you who know little history. Now, move NP captured much of the stuff that these other constraints captured and simplified the statement. In fact, but one of the questions to be asked, I mean, I don't know about the history, in fact, did that degree 2 theory play a role in motivating people to do that, to actually come up with a simple theory? Now, as a matter of fact, the leading players in that syntactic theory were very familiar with the learnability work, and I have no idea what was going through their minds. When they made the arguments, they talked about the scientific simplicity. Let's get this down really simpler. But in fact, were they motivated because they saw from the work in learnability the immense learning difficulties that the unstructured transformational analysis would require, and the kind of constraints that in fact had to be adopted. So learnability theory was always an intrinsic part of linguistic theory. That's the point I want to make. Okay, and the field was greatly excited by that and got a lot of visibility. We haven't had that kind of success since, I believe, those who work on learning models.
Ken, you should conclude.
Okay, I just finished with this. Along the way, so parameter setting models came in, and we have to talk later about what happens with parameter setting models. I'll conclude.
Okay, so we can move to our second question, which is the role of frequency in parameter setting? And I give the floor to Ken Wexler. So you can continue with the second question.
Okay, I've got some frequency arguments. Oh, here it is. Okay, so the question was, what in the world? I didn't get a chance to state my learning model that I would most try to push. My own view, as I said, is there is no really successful one for parameter setting, and I'd love to get to the reasons why. But let me state quickly. Q theories are systematically worked out by Sakis and Fodor, and I have a lot of detail on that. And actually, that's a remarkably serious paper and very good, but there are lots of reasons I believe they don't work. I don't have time to really state them. Charles's theory, the variational learning model, well, let's go on triggers. The model I didn't propose was first proposed in order to show that, in fact, the standard idea of parameter setting via triggers and the usual idea of learning actually didn't work. Okay, so it was a model which I thought captured closely the standard linguistic theory idea, and I always knew it wouldn't work. Well, later on, I really was sure it didn't work. And triggers sort of showed that for a very simple system, and it's only been sort of amplified since for more complicated systems. Charles proposes an interesting variation on the triggers model, in which kids have multiple grammars at every stage, and you learn both. You actually increase the probability of every parameter that's been used to derive a sentence, even if it's the wrong parameter. It's an extremely slow model, and I think makes lots of mispredictions. And the main problem there is, for whatever reason, so far as I know, the biggest problem in parameter setting is when you have more than one parameter, interaction of parameters. It's easy to show that. It's been demonstrated many times. I've done it formally and precisely. And moreover, the fact that I've argued before, for example, in the triggers paper and other places, there are no global triggers. No triggers that will work independent of the other parameters. So basically, if say a kid has 40 parameters, you would need something like 2 to the 40 different kinds of triggers. It just doesn't work. Charles thinks he's got a solution, but so far as I can tell, in any of the syntactic examples he's worked out, none of them ever deal with more than one parameter. And the three examples that I know best, the no subject example, the sort of topic drop of VSO, kids in Dutch are supposed to actually, according to Charles, start with a verb first grammar, and an example trying to explain the optional infinitive stage via the input rather than through the obvious process of maturation, for which is extensive evidence. All of those just are wrong. So I'd have to go through those. So I don't think we have, so I don't think there's any, and also I don't think that we have any examples with more than one parameter, which is where the problem is. So I think we're all in the same boat, not having, basically for different reasons, not there being no successful model. Now on frequency, there's got to be some role for frequency. There's got to be some role for frequency. But it's not so easy because common sense tells us that. Not so easy to discern. We know that there's very early parameter setting. I don't think that the basic parameters aren't set late for the most part. And shows that very young kids set the parameters correctly with no evidence of missetting. So they must have learned the correct setting before the earliest age, say 18 months, even in some cases 15 months. So we don't know how frequent the effective examples are before this young age. What is the young child able to use as learning material? We don't really know that, but it's conceivable frequency plays some role before 15 months of age, say. Perhaps the few known examples of possible parameter missetting will help. For example, some kids in English, in long distance questions, sometimes leave a trace in an intermediate copy of the specifier of the lower competent higher in a long distance WH question, the work of Ralph Thornton and quite a few people since. For example, saying something like, which person do you think who said that, instead of which person do you think said that? It's an interesting missetting because there's no examples that the kid has to say this. English doesn't have that. I mean, other languages have it, but English doesn't. So kid makes an error in setting the parameter, but the frequency of his input is 0. So it's not exactly an argument for the role of frequency. Okay, now here's another argument against frequency. Okay, it's often said that subject experience of passives of subject experience foods are late because they don't exist very often in the input to the kids. I quote Gordon and Chaffetz, for example, who wrote that. Well, we've gone through subject questions of subject experience and WH questions. These turn out to be as infrequent in the input to the kid as subject experience passives. Yet, kids have no problem in comprehending subject experience WH questions, although they have a great problem in comprehending subject experience of verbal passives. Okay, so frequencies doesn't seem to be explanatory at all. Whether it's infrequent does not tell us whether kids actually learn that. Now, of course, any linguist will instantly say, but these aren't the same animals. WH questions and passes, but that's exactly the point. They ain't the same animals, and it's got to do with a linguistic structure and how those mature, basically, and it doesn't have anything to do with frequency. Okay. Furthermore, and for the development of finiteness, for example, which we know is maturation, or the evidence is overwhelming that it's a maturation of development. It's not really finiteness, it's more a deeper part of the computational system. No time to go into that here, but the acquisition people know that well. Okay, if we look at this kind of result, we see that no environmental variables play any role at all in the development of finiteness, including mother's education, which is the biggest predictor, one of the biggest, maybe the biggest predictor of the development of vocabulary in kids. So the environment doesn't seem to play any role. And how could finiteness actually play any serious role? The frequency of finiteness play any serious role? There's so many finite sentences the kid hears. How could this have a serious role in what happens? If you look at heritability and behavioral genetics work, we find that it's called in this behavioral genetics publication in a genetics journal. Verb inflections is what they call finiteness, by the way. Heredity is greater for that. Heritability of that is greater than that for any other variable. It's up at almost over 70%, almost 80%. That's the dark black one. Whereas the role of environment is that little white part down there in the bottom one. It's what, less than 10%, 7%. So there's no role for environmental influence in the development of finiteness, every structure. So going by the usual biological arguments, in addition to the usual linguistic arguments and acquisition arguments, it shows, I think frequency doesn't tell us anything serious about language acquisition.
Okay. Thank you.
I
give the floor to Charles Young. Charles.
Okay. There's a long and a short version of this. Parameter setting, before we talk about frequency parameter setting, we have to ask the question whether parameter setting is really the valid way of looking at language, and then therefore looking at a valid way of looking at language acquisition. And the particular model I consider, the variational model, is completely domain general. It's reinforcement learning, rats do it, humans do it. So it works as well or as badly as the theory of parameters, as the theory of language. So as Ken pointed out, in the limit, parameters interact in highly complex ways, in fact, in arbitrarily complex ways. That's going to defeat all possible learning models. So the real question becomes the empirical one, namely, do the parameters linguists consider to be plausible actually constitute a easy to navigate kind of learning space? The best effort on that front is, as Ken mentioned, was William Sacker's Jenny Fodor's domain, where they studied 13 word order parameters exhaustively and derived all the possible structures, and then tested a bunch of learning models. It turns out that the kind of a global trigger for some of the parameters actually do exist. And the variation model, as well as the structural learning model, work fairly well on that domain. But I digress, because now I really don't think the rosy picture of parameter settings is tenable. So one of the reasons I adopted the parameter setting model at the time was because for many phenomena in the grammar, I have no idea how to learn them without having to bake them in. But now I do. We have some model that can just derive the many regularities in a language from distributional basis. So therefore, the need for assuming the innateness of such parameters where all the options are made available for the child to pick and choose, never mind frequencies, is no longer as urgent as before. So in a paper that I co-authored with Stephen Crane, Bob Burrick, Noam, as well as Johan Bohaus a few years ago, we try to articulate a theory or a picture of the role of parameters and innate structures in the theory of language acquisition. Try very hard to find compelling reasons for assuming parameters in language acquisition, we had very little left. Okay, so I think it's possible to consider the possibility that maybe UG is not as overdetermined as we thought it to be, where maybe a lot of the regularities in language can be acquired on distributional basis. But fortunately, frequency lives on. So the variational learning model has been adapted for word learning. In my personally, as one of my favorite lines of work over the years, in collaboration with Ida Gleitman, John Truswell, and a former student, John Stevens, where we deployed the token frequency sensitive kind of probabilistic learning models for word learning, especially what John and Lila called easy words, namely words you have to pick up from observation from the environment in a highly ambiguous setting, where adding probabilities appears to increase the robustness of word learning processes in exactly these kind of environmental conditions. And so that's so again, the questions of whether parameter setting is or is not a valid theory of language learning is much more dependent on not just on the learning model, but on the but the theory of parameter as a theory of language to begin with. And that's and as we understand distributional learning better, and there's going to be an interesting division of labor between what's learned and what must be building.
Okay, thank you. And now we are at the third and last question, which is the role of the third factor in your model? And it's still Charles' turn.
Okay, this is an interesting one, right? My entirety of my work comes down to two equations. One was the one for variational learning, the other is for the tolerance. So that's pretty much all I've done. I really started this work probably before the term third factor was even introduced. So the variational learning model was written as a term paper initially for King's class. That was 1998. But the incompleteness of a parameter setting was already clear, even as I worked out the variational model. So I knew there had to be cases where the child has to juggle between rules and exceptions. And so I started to work on what became the tolerance principle in 2002. So for the variational model, as I said, is a form of reinforcement learning, which is something that everybody has throughout the animal kingdom. At the time, it struck me as, roughly insane for a biological system not to make use of a mechanism that's being made available from the very ancient, past. And certainly not reasonable to reject the possibility that learning language may implicate domain general learning principles, right? For the tolerance principle, I think it really brings out to the third factor consideration to another dimension, whereas in the consideration of the balance between rules and exceptions, proposing explicit computational model, whereas it's really by the ordering of to calculate the cost of rule application versus storage and retrieval. And the proposal really one is of having performance considerations determining the shape of the competence grammar. So I think that fits right squarely in the consideration of third factors. Then, of course, all of these were emboldened by Noam's three-factor paper. So what we have now, especially with respect to the tolerance principle, it seems to be a simple threshold that cuts through pretty messy data to derive the systematic regularities in the face of noise and in the face of exceptions, right? So Mitch Marcus, who I've been working with for quite a while now, for 15 years since I moved to Penn, pointed out interestingly that this kind of character of having very simple, quick and dirty way of abstracting regularities seems to be what's suited in a fairly chaotic ecological world in which an organism has to interact with the environment. So again, comes back to the question of what's the balance between theory of learning and theory of language? And one of the revealing aspects of working on learning theory is that sometimes once you have a theory of what's learnable, it really reduces the burden on the theory of grammar. For instance, we always worry about why is some expression ungrammatical. The traditional way is to try to block it from the machinery of UG. But another option is that maybe once you have a theory of learnable, you also have a theory of unlearnable. Maybe given this kind of data that children has access to, it's impossible for them to ever consider the possibility that we as linguists have tried very hard to rule out a priori. Okay, so again, I think this is these are the type of third factor considerations, the plausibility of language, or plausibility of language acquisition in an ecological and evolutionary setting, so-called Darwin's problem, as Norbert put it first. So the problem of Darwin's problem really presupposes solution to Plato's problem, namely how do children learn acquisition of language in the first place. Then we can talk about the biological considerations. So I think we're back to square one, namely we have not square one, hopefully we made some progress. We're back to the empirical question of how to account for the varied cross-linguistic data in language acquisition. So third factor has worked out well for me. Okay, so I hope this, and I think that would also work out for you, and also for future theories of language acquisition.
Okay, thank you. And now it's Ken's turn. Please, Ken.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to get back to the third factor. Okay, let me share the screen. Okay, so just to remind you of the third factor. The third factor is the range of factors outside of the first two factors, which are the genetic endowment, otherwise known as UG, which I think we understand rather beautifully in many ways, and linguistic experience. And what Noam calls the third factor is the general considerations of computational complexity, processes and limitations that are not language specific. By the way, we've all tried, to get learning models, and going all the way back to the first learning models in learnability theory in the 60s and 70s when he was working on them, that are rather general. The one that I picked had to do with a more cognitive model. Charles picks the linear model of Bush and Mosler, which I know very well. And in fact, the linear model was immediately rejected in psychology almost as soon as it was proposed. It just doesn't work for all sorts of reasons. A better model, then more cognitive models came in. So it's not general in the sense that it's accepted in other domains. Nevertheless, there is no real good learning model in any domain. Okay. So third factor has been strong consideration of my work on learnability since the 1960s, not quoted by that name, of course. So you asked, what role does it play? It plays every role. Now, Chomsky, of course, includes maturation as part of the universal grammar, genetic endowment, not only accepting its scientific coherence, but saying that there are good reasons to believe it, compelling evidence of the existence of maturation and growth of language. Okay, so maturation is a crucial part of actually what's going on, but that's not really part of the third factor. It's part of the genetic endowment. So we have to sort of include that there. And the evidence for that is just overwhelming at this point in grammatical development. Considerations of third factor include general considerations, and frequency is not among them. Now, Noam does mention general learning models as a third factor consideration. And of course, the kind of cognitive model that we've been suggesting purely, they do seem to be fairly general learning models to the extent we have any, rather than a stepping in model of the kind that other kinds of theories predict. And those theories then predict extremely slow and error-ridden learning, and the kind of prediction that I'm talking about does not want to do that. That's exactly what it doesn't want to do. And when you think about the freezing principle, remember the freezing principle was done for reasons of learnability. It was needed for boundedness as part of the proof in the 1980 book, which was actually done in the 70s. It was an essential part of the proof. Now, so in fact, freezing principle was derived because of the third factor, because limitations on the kid, which were general cognitive limitations in their processing, demanded that the grammars be constrained or else it'd be unlearnable. So the third factor has been crucial in the theoretical work on learnability theory from the beginning, and has played a real and rather strong role in all this. Now, of course, as Chomsky points out, minimalism, derivation of simplicity, example of the third factor, and the constraints can lead to computational simplicity. So, now I quickly realized the freezing principle might be more general than just in language, and started searching for analogies in other cognitive domains. Now, the problem here, and this is where linguists shouldn't fool themselves, okay? Because if you don't know other fields, it's very hard to find analogs in other domains because other cognitive domains don't have models. You can't go to other domains and say, what's the model and can I find a comparable concept or something relevant? For the most part, there are no models, anything approaching what linguistic theory has. Linguistic theory is unique in that regard. There are no principles in these other domains, okay? Now, the closest that one might come, I would say, would be in the domain of vision. So I was worried about vision then, but I couldn't get any help. Actually, so I wasn't at MIT then, but I talked to Noam at a conference and he suggested I contact David Marr, probably by letter at those times. I don't recall a useful response, or even whether I got a response at the moment. I asked friends who study vision, and they taught whether the freezing principle, something like that, could be relevant. The way I asked the question was, when a structure undergoes a non-structure preserving transformation, the interior of the structure can't be analyzed further. Do you have any principle like that in vision? The answer I got was, you couldn't tell because all transformations in vision were linear, that is structure preserving. Interesting answer. I'm not the one to judge whether that's true or not, but if it is true, and that was those were visual kind of experts who were telling me that, then we don't have that type of thing in other domains. So that might not be a principle from other domains, but the general concept that of boundedness is part of the third factor, okay, and therefore crucial. Other argument. So degree 2 boundedness is a quintessential third factor. That was there before it was called that, okay, and I think it had something to do. Okay, other examples. Get these out of the way, I can hardly read my own. Okay, in the second point here on this slide, we argue that we worried about earlier deterministic models, not in the linguistic domain, not in generative grammar, but Mark Gold's rather influential and brilliant work in mathematics assumed that there was infinite appearance of any item. It was obviously unfeasible, what we now call the third factor would rule it out. So we switched to probabilistic appearance of input and captured some of the effects of the other thing, bounding the probability away from zero of any input, and that allowed for learning. So another example of the third factor. The learning algorithm was very simple because young kids had to employ it. Again, the third factor. So semantic information was assumed to be available to the learner constantly, and I constantly worried about the extent that that might be available. When it was actually available to the kid, again, the third factor. I argue for positive information on the basis of Brown's empirical results, unlike many other models. Again, example of the third factor, what is actually available to the actual organism. It resulted in the degree 2 theory and rather detailed mathematics being developed. So the general impetus for a whole set of constraints was that transformations had to be strongly constrained. And of course, soon they were constrained in a stronger way with move NP. So these might have, in fact, influenced linguistic theory. So learnability theory was once exciting, believe it or not, learning models, to the whole field of linguistics. Can it be that way again? We're not there right now. I think language acquisition is and should be exciting to the field of linguistics right now. I don't think the learning models are even remotely in that stage. It's unfortunate. I can't think of anything theoretical that's been influenced by a learning model recently, including my own, by the way, my own efforts, and I would agree with that. I wouldn't either. It's hard to argue that today's learnability theory is crucial for linguistic theory. We can argue the results of language acquisition. They've done it many times. I've argued for that many times, and so have many others. I see Therese in front of us. She's argued for it. Luigi is here. He's argued for it. And many, David Pazetsky might be here. He's argued for it. It's to make it central to linguistic theory. We need, and Nina has argued for it. But and many others, I'm sorry, can't name everybody. I don't see everybody on who's here. To make it central to linguistic theory, we need real concentration on theoretical results and real results having to do with the learning model. Distributional models, I don't know what Charles has in mind on those things, so I'll have no comments. None of the parameter setting models have it now. I admire, by the way, the Fodor and Sacker's seriousness. They not only propose things, but they study it, and they've adopted, a lot of the problems I've set forth, and they've actually derived quite precise results. But they're also critical of their own results, as they should be, because there's something wrong. So, for example, the verb second parameter, that the verb must move to C, has always been a devil for models to get correct. When you have more than one parameter, what I've discovered in triggers, for example, it's been a devil to get that right. And they work it out with a proposal over their 12 parameter system, but they realize in the end, they have to assume that move, the verb second being set to positive, is the unmarked setting. And they very much worry about that, because then the trigger setting, the setting for the cue, is the opposite of what you would think of in terms of linguistic or psycholinguistic defaults. So they're the opposite default, and they're very much worried about that, as they should be. So there are a lot of issues that go on in that kind of work. So it's a rather precise work, but it hasn't solved the problems in many ways.
Okay, I think you should come to an end.
Okay. I'll end.
So you finished?
Okay, let me just say, I'll give the conclusion. Learnability theory has constantly paid homage to the third factor, way before it was called thus. It seems a crucial necessity. And given the precision with which learnability theory has been carried out, the questions could be asked. So the precision may mask empirically incorrect assumptions. It's crucial, however, to make sure we understand what other fields have done, what they have achieved and not, and when they show there are good reasons for certain kind of models, for example, learning capacity, to actually pay attention. Okay, I'll just stop at that. There's more. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ken. So a very brief summary so that we can then move to questions. So we have seen that language acquisition, or a theory of language acquisition, must take into account the fact that there is structure, and therefore there is some stability in the system that is reached, but at the same time there must be also some plasticity. And in this connection, there has been discussion about the issue of frequency, whereby frequency in some cases doesn't seem to play a role, because the child comes out with solutions that are not in the input. At the same time, we have heard something about the theory of parameter, and some question that relate also to linguistic theory, whether a parameter is a good notion in linguistic theory. At the same time, concerning frequency again, we have seen that some aspects of language acquisition can benefit if we integrate some notion of probabilities. And concerning the last question of the third factor, language acquisition has to take into account third factor, and It has been since the very beginning, because in order to explain the child, what the child does and how the child acquires a language, third factors aspects are very important. So, and with this, I give the floor to the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand, or you can write in the chat. Yeah, Richie, you can unmute yourself.
Good idea. This question, I guess, is more directed to Charles. The discussion of rules and exceptions is easy to understand in areas like past tense verbs in English that would have fallen under classical morphology. But the notion of exception in what corresponds to non-morphology syntax is harder to see clearly. Is it intended that this notion of exception carries over to syntax in general, or is it really just limited to apparent cases of exceptions in something that looks more like what we would call morphology?
Unmuting yourself is always a good idea. Yes, it is intended to carry over to morphology, because I can't imagine you evolve a different learning process for morphology than a different one for syntax. So there are exceptions in syntax, for instance, the well-known double object constructions and so on, right? So how can you, you can't generally do donate in a double object, but you can do it for assign or offer or a host of other items. Even in the more, more the conventional cases of syntax, sometimes you have embedded V2, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have V3. A lot of these are subject to exceptions from the learner's point of view. From the learner's point of view, the learner is going to hear some items participating in a construction, but not others, and others violate the constraint on that construction. So the learner has to make some decisions on when to generalize and when not to. So that's what I mean by certainly by the proposal of such learning procedures applicable to other cases beyond morphology.
The problem is that the term exception tends to lead to an interpretation whereby you have the feeling that it's something that cannot be explained. And that doesn't seem to be appropriate for the cases you mentioned. For example, the case of donate is often cited, but it was noted in a paper by O'Grady 40 years ago that passives of double object constructions with donate are actually better than the active sentences. I mean, that suggests that there's a lot more to it, and that the fact that you don't donate somebody money is not something that can't be explained.
Okay, 2 points. One is that Beth Levine listed about 250 such verbs. And according to her assessment, 115 or 120 or so participate, 250 eligible verbs eligible for the double object construction, under half of them actually do participate in the construction. So do we need a theory for every single verb that's exception to that principle? One of the things
we need an overall theory that can tell us something about these apparent.
Let me make a more general point here, right? The theory of learning is, aka the tolerance principle, gives you an acceptable level of things you don't need to explain from a psychological point of view, from a purely learning theoretic point of view. Now, are there finer grained details that we stare at them as a linguist long enough we can figure out something going on? Maybe. But the theory of learning says that's no longer necessary. as far as the child is concerned, that's within the tolerable level of exceptions that the learner can reasonably detect from the input data. So it's really I guess what you're really saying is that what's the difference, or is there a difference, or should we accept a difference between irregularities in the data that linguists can uncover with sophisticated methods, including query each other with for ungrammaticality judgments which children don't have, or the patterns that children can extract from the data within the tolerable limit, given a psychologically motivated theory of learning? I guess that's a real question here.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just make a comment too?
Yeah.
I would agree with Richie's comment. I mean, to start out by worried about so-called exceptions for syntax doesn't seem to me to be a productive way to go about the study of learning, especially when we know that there's systematic variation. I would just like to add one thing. Child grammar is remarkably regular in regard to these kinds of things. I mean, the data are just remarkably precise, and you're not going to find that in any other kind of cognitive development study. In the study of syntax, you're going to find, when you look at how the parameters are set, you're going to find remarkable results, even in the production data of all things. So that there were very few exceptions, even in the production data, and those would chalk up to some other kind of explanation, like a lack of attention or something of that kind. So that, in fact, even the developmental data actually parallel what we think of in terms of the nature of universal grammar, systematically regular, and not only that, but coarse linguistic differences are based upon very particular settings that parameters emerge remarkably well, so that the same phenomenon in development doesn't happen in one language, it happens in another language, or because of a different parameter setting in a certain language, which is actually a remarkable result. So the fact that exceptions are really limited is even instantiated in what we used to think of as a rather messy domain of language acquisition.
Okay, we can move to the next question by Luigi.
Okay, hi. Actually, I have a question for Ken and a question for Charles. I guess I have to choose. So let me ask Ken. The question is about your use of maturation, right? That's as in your classical work. So you basically maintain the assumption that there is a certain kind of maturation that is somehow built in universal grammar. Now, I guess one conceptual question is, what do you think of, how can that be connected with Chomsky's recent ideas about the fact that there are two very basic guidelines that should be respected. One is learnability, of course, and the other is evolvability. Now, the two cannot really be on the same at the same level, because learnability can be expressed very precisely, whereas evolvability is at best a rather general guideline, but still it may be a useful guideline. So how do you think that your notion of maturation as part of UG can relate to that notion? And perhaps a more general question, why you think, I mean, as you have been working on this idea for several decades, do you have any idea of why certain properties of UG would be subjected to maturation and other properties would not, at least not visibly, right? So do you have any comments on that?
What was that second concept of norms that you mentioned, not the learnability, the second one? I just didn't get the word.
It's evolvability, the fact that UG must have evolved, right? And so
yes, of course, evolved.
How did that happen?
Okay, Luigi, these are very good and very deep questions. Okay, so I'll just take a shot on it. Learnability is sort of obvious. I don't think we have to deal with that right now. You really were worried about evolvability. all we can do at the moment is speculate. That is, there was a time years ago when Derek Bickerton was very excited by Hagit Barer, my early maturation work, thinking that in fact this was a long time ago, after the work, not too long after the work came out, thinking that in fact the patterns that we observed in the developing child related strongly to what happened in the evolution of language, okay? Using his kind of evidence, creos and so on, and other things he knew, before the books on evolution were even written. I thought it was very interesting and could have been true, but we have to realize that we don't really know if it should be true even. I always go back to a book I read years and years ago by Stephen Jay Gould on ontogeny and phylogeny, in which he shows that in fact the usual, what you might expect to be true is just not right. That in fact, moving from a kid to an adult, the developmental change is paralleled by what happens in older and newer times in evolution. That in fact, children start out with the less evolved things, and then adults have the more evolved things. Rather, he argued, in even more cases, you get exactly the opposite. Children are the innovators, so to speak, from the evolutionary standpoint. Okay, so that's, now why that's so, I can't exactly say, I can speculate. Now, in maturation is of course intimately related to biological maturation. And in fact, one can look at particular structures. We know very well, for example, that the cortex matures. We know in fact very well that the linguistic areas mature. It's simply a fact of biology. Now we have to worry when we get two pieces of maturation, going back to another of your question, one structure versus another one, why one matures and one doesn't, or even why if two mature, they do them at such different ages. As you well know, there are certain pieces that are argued to develop by age 3, and other pieces that apparently mature only around age 8, okay, in the grammatical capacity. Now, why should that be? Well, these structures might very well have different representations in the linguistic biological system and where they do. So we might be able to find a biological explanation. Now, why that piece of biology matures at different rates, I am in no position to explain. It's presumably a biological question. So to some extent, it might be a brute fact of biology. That's a little bit unsatisfying to us. To me, along with everybody else, I assume, was we might think that general thinking about linguistic considerations can give us the answer, but we might not be able to. It may be biological, and there may be, as many of, as Noam has long argued, accidents of biology, or it may relate to the different way that you can express an optimal system of mapping sound to meaning, and how the biology has responded to that. So I don't have anything too precise to say, and I could say much more though, none of it being very precise. So I think these are very good questions, excellent questions. We should keep them in mind as we think through the maturational system. And why they have to, that it happens, I think, is unquestionable now, and it's deeply explanatory. And even with respect to parameter setting, it seems to help us. So if you even look at the Q system of Sackers and Fodor, when they talk about defaults and so on, this has probably got to do with maturation, if it's true at all, in their case. And when you look at sort of the parameter setting work of people like Anna Gavarro, when she's worked on what's happened with respect to topic drop and so on, it relates to various things that the kind of questions. So we have some precise acquisition ways of looking at it, but the deeper questions, of course, are still open.
Thank you.
Okay, Luigi, you can ask the second question as well.
Really? Thank you. That's incredible. Okay, thank you. Okay, so it's for Charles. So the if you look at current models of parameters, I think a very widely shared view is that something like the Chomsky-Borer conjecture is right, right? That is to say that essentially the locus of parameters is the functional lexicon. So basically, fixing parameters is figuring out the properties of the functional lexicon, right? That seems to be a reasonable way to look at things. And you may want to call them parameters or just differences, but the fact that some languages are OV and some languages are VO, the child has got to figure that out inevitably. Now, the question I wanted to ask you is, as you have worked both on parametric models and acquisition, and on the acquisition on word learning, essentially, do you think that this kind of view would lead to the conclusion that parameter setting is a particular instance of word learning, essentially? So you essentially learn the words of the functional lexicon and you figure out the properties of your language. So you think that it's possible to somehow establish a parallel between the acquisition of words and the acquisition of syntactic properties of the kind that are normally dealt with in terms of parametric systems, like word order, for instance?
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. So when I did the variational model, it's not really a theory of learning. It's a theory of picking an option or several options out of all the options that are already given to you, right? So this is the work on the tolerance principle model, which is really one that the learner has to construct, if you will, the hypotheses, then subsequently verify them and confirm or reject them as more data is processed. So it really goes back to the model of acquisition in aspects, I think. That is that we need an evaluation procedure or evaluation measure to, and there's some very elegant quotes in Language and Mind and so on, where Noam was proposing what he called a sort of an abductive theory of learning, where the child forms hypotheses, then subsequently verify them and confirm them. This is also a nice convergence with the work like Lila has been doing all those years. And that's also where we find the convergence between some of my work and her thinking has been extremely influential, right? So I really do think you can call them parameters or not, but these are on the Chomsky-Borer conjecture. Yes, those are language variation reduces to the options in the functional categories, but that has to be learned. And so this is simply a proposal of how that is learned.
I want to make a comment on Charles, what you're saying. It's interesting that you're talking about going back to abduction. Abduction, of course, is really another name for what's going on rather than a solution, right? I mean, that's Peirce's term. We need something which allows a kid to do what the kid does. Personally, I think it's quite clear that UG is such. UG is a solution. It doesn't help us with this variational problem and learning, setting the parameters, but UG is the abduction solution that we were looking for, and I think it's gone in the right direction. And the whole point of much work has been to try to get rid of fairly arbitrary rankings of grammars that don't have a principle behind them. And there's been tremendous progress in linguistic theory and therefore learnability because of that. The one thing I would ask about with the kind of proposal you were talking about distributional learning job is Charles, because I don't have it down well, just from the few comments you've made about it. It sounds to me like you're talking about cross-situational learning, okay? And if there's anything that's important in the relatively recent work of Lila and John, it's the argument against cross-situational learning. And I think it's completely right. And for the models I proposed from the beginning have tried to stay away from cross-situational learning. To some extent, some Q theories have a lot of cross-situational learning in them. It doesn't really work. But the experimental evidence in psychology against cross-linguistic learning, say the Gleitman-Truscott kind of work, really is quite strong. Okay, so I don't think you want to make course situation learning part of a distributional learning model. At least it wouldn't agree with that work at all.
I would like, since Lila's here, I would like her, let her speak for herself. I want to come back to your earlier point, namely abductive learning. I've laid something on the table. It's an equation, it's got two numbers. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, let's move on, right? I mean, so you can accuse me of being wrong, but you can't accuse me of being not being honest. I've laid out a proposal here. Everybody can try it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, someone come up with something better. So it's not quite the case when someone says learning or abductive learning or distributional learning, they're just waving their hands. We're not waving our hands. I laid down an equation for everybody to see and to use.
Great, thank you very much. And I give the floor to Cecilia.
Well, thank you everybody for taking time and being here with a very interesting discussion from all of you. Especially, I would like to thank the discussants, our moderator, but also everybody who participated. As you see, we have already one more linguistic flash mob, which will be held on the 21st of January next year. And it's on case. The two discussants are Mark Baker from Rutgers University and Julie Legate from the University of Pennsylvania. It's on case. Well, now, as usual, I would also like to thank all our organizing and technical committee that you see here in the slides. And yes, this is us. And I wish you all a very Merry Christmas and stay safe in these hard times. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Happy holidays.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Have a good break.
Au revoir.